Welcome and good morning, everyone. My name is Maxine Willits. I am the fundraising manager at Young Brent Foundation. This morning's webinar, Global Thinking for a Future Without Racism, should last about an hour and a half. If we do run over, please feel free to leave the session and go and do what you need to do next, because we will be recording the session, and the link will be available on our website by the end of the week. I will briefly introduce the team to you. We have Deji Adeosun, who is the Youth and Community Engagement Manager, working directly with all of the members of Young Brent Foundation. We've got Chris Murray, who is the CEO, doing an amazing job over the past 12 months. And we have Faith Williams, who is the Grants and Partnership Manager at Young Brent Foundation. Young Brent Foundation is part of a network of young people's foundations that was set up by John Lyons Charity, essentially in the 9 boroughs northwest of London, to support the youth sector, and that network is growing now into the United Kingdom as well. This is our second seminar. Young Harrow Foundation hosted the first on the 24th of June, and this was in response to the death of George Floyd 2 months ago. We felt it was important to bring the youth sector together to start to debate and discuss how we support young people through this challenging time, but also how we just really put this discussion around race and identity on the table for debate, and really to help inform our working with children and young people. So from the last seminar, we had 4 panelists. One of those panelists was Veronica Mason, who I'll introduce in a moment. And essentially, what we've seen over the past 2 months is some positive moves. We've seen the BBC remove Little Britain because of the black stereotypes and blackface that are on those series, and even the key actors, people in those positions, David Williams and Matt Lucas, have since said that they wouldn't work on that programme, that today is definitely a different time, and they wouldn't do that programming in the same way as they would do today. We've also seen the governors of Oxford University vote to remove the statue of Cecil Rhodes, and we've seen many sportsmen and many sportswomen take the knee during sporting events. So on today's webinar, as I said, we have Veronica Mason, who is a lecturer at London Metropolitan University, and over the past 2 months, just in speaking to Veronica, what strikes me is that I always manage to come away with having just a better understanding of racial identity, particularly within the British context, and just learnt so much from Veronica. So absolutely delighted that she's going to spend this morning with us, sharing with us just the knowledge she has and the experience that she brings in working with children and young people. So without further ado, Veronica, can I hand over to you?
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. So as you can see, the title of our talk is Global Thinking for a Future Without Racism. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is kind of destructing race and the ideology, and let's kind of start to understand what is underlining this issue in terms of Black Lives Matter, and what's happening today, and how that links to the historical context and also quite a systemic context as well. So one of the things that we've seen all of the protests on the news, etc. And one of the things, obviously, that the Black Lives Matter movement is highlighting racism in our society. And it's reminding us that racism hasn't really, we haven't come as far as we should have come probably by now. But one thing that is highlighting is that this issue is not new. It's just a continuous issue. Okay, George Floyd is not the first Black man to be killed by the police. This is, one of many, and it continues to keep happening. So we need to dissect, what is underpinning this? In terms of racism in society, what is actually underpinning all of this? And what can we do about it? Because even though the incident with George Floyd was in America, obviously in terms of the protests here, it's resonating, this issue is resonating with people all across the world, okay? So the talk really today is going to focus in terms of what is actually going on, what underpins what's going on, and what can we do about it going forward, particularly as practitioners working with young people. And how do we deal with this topic, especially in a country where people are very uncomfortable to talk about any issues of race, period, as well. So what we're going to do is we are going to try and dissect this by concentrating on a few themes, okay? So first I'm going to just do a little bit of an intro in terms of deconstructing race, because it's something that we kind of all know what it is, but maybe we don't really think about what race actually is and where it comes from and how it kind of underpins what is going on at the moment. And then I'm going to apply that to education, the issue of race and racism. Okay, so I started to talk, if you were there at the last webinar, I started to talk a little bit about this in the last webinar. I'm then going to move on to the hypodermic syringe effect of race and media. Okay, very interesting title. I'm going to dissect exactly what the hypodermic syringe model actually means, and then how all of this links to systemic and institutionalized racism, okay, overall, which kind of explains what is happening today. And near the end, I'm going to be talking about steps forward. So how do we think about a future without racism? What needs to be done? What can we do? What do we do as organizations? What do we do as a society in order to move things on? So I hope that's okay. I hope you're going to stay with me and kind of learn something. Also, there will be sections as well when we are going to be asking you some questions and have time to reflect on what I'm saying. And there is opportunities also to ask some questions near the end. So if I'm talking about anything, can you have a question, do write that down, okay? And we can take questions near the end of the discussion, okay? So let's get on to our first kind of grounding in terms of destructing race. Now, really, this issue of race didn't really come up until probably about the 15th century in regards to white explorers actually starting to explore other territories and other countries. And then obviously meeting other people that did not look like them. Now, it's in our human psychology, our cognitive psychology, to categorize. And that's actually what was done in terms of the process of racialization. You're comparing one person and how you look to another person, and then you start to categorize. So in terms of categorization, that is quite a natural process to compare somebody of another group to yourself. However, when it comes to Black people and Black Africans, what was destructive was then how Black people were categorized. Now, very early on with these explorers, you have to remember this was a time before, TV and social media, etc. So we have to realize that when these explorers were actually going to Africa and meeting these new communities, what they would do is they would come back and they would report quite a sensationalized story, okay, which would go out to the masses. So I'm just going to read you a quotation from one of those explorers. So Thomas Herbert, and this was in 1634. So he was describing his trip to Africa and what he saw. So he's describing Africans, they have beastly compilation and conjuncture. So as to be considered, they bear the resemblance with baboons, which I would observe frequently kept the company of women. They possess the soul of beasts. Okay, now this is what these explorers were actually coming back and then reporting to the mainstream public in terms of Africa. So already, not only have you just categorized as different, there was something in there in terms of actually, they're not even human. And if you pick out some of those wordings, it's kind of, comparable to baboons, comparable to an animal. They kept the frequent company of women. So that's where we start to get the stereotype about the hypersexuality of Black African people. And they possess the souls of beasts. So already we're starting to kind of look at Black Africans as evil, devil, sin, etc. Okay, so we had all of this going on and been kind of flooded back to the public. And then obviously by the late 18th century and 19th century, this is when these same said explorers, etc., started to think about scientific reasons in terms of how we can categorize ourselves from other people. And this was obviously in the midst of actually going over to countries and attempting to be an imperial power over other countries, and also laid the foundation and justification for slavery. Okay, so one person who's kind of known as the founding father of racist ideology was a French aristocrat called Arthur de Benoit, and he came up with 3 races. Okay, so one is the white race, the Caucasian Aryan race. The second was the black race, the Negroid. Okay, and the third was the yellow race. Okay, the Mongoloid. Okay, and as far as he was concerned, the white race was the most superior race out of all of those races. And the black race was the most inferior race. Okay, and they were inferior in regards to intellect and intelligence. They were inferior in terms of emotional instability, and they were more likened to an animal. So we're now starting to get not only racism, but the process of dehumanization, that Black people are not even human. Okay, and then what we had was lots of pseudoscience which followed that to try and support those myths and those stereotypes. So you may have heard of this. So one was cranial race theory. So that's kind of looking at the shape of skulls, the study of the shape and size of skulls. So let's have an image here. Okay, so we can see here. Okay, we're looking at the shape and the size of the skulls. Now you can see by this image exactly what is being said here. Okay, so it goes exactly with what our explorer was saying in terms of comparing Black people to animals. And this is now, we have now got scientific evidence looking at these skulls that they are more likened to apes and animals rather than actual human beings. Okay, you also had phrenology as well, which measured lumps on the skull as well, and it kind of determined your emotional stability and personality. And again, that was also used to prove that Black people were less intelligent and emotionally unstable. Now, this is where it gets where now we are now naturalizing these stereotypes and these myths as fact. And this then lays the foundation for them what happened in the ideologies throughout the period of slavery. And obviously you're looking over 350 years. And even though later on, all of this science was completely discredited and said, actually, no, actually it's not true at all. The bottom line is we've had so many years of this being naturalized now that it's become internalized by all people in society, including Black people themselves as well. And what is my point here? So my point here is when we're looking at this issue of race, this word and this concept that we don't really want to talk about, what we need to recognize is that race is actually a social construction. There is nothing biological about different racial groups. And whilst appearances may be different, in terms of actual DNA, there's more difference within each perceived racial group than there is across racial groups. Okay, so this is actually proven. So this is, this issue of race, black, white, etc., is all a social construction. So therefore, one of the things that I always think about, that if race is constructed, it can therefore be deconstructed, because we don't have a biological foundation for this. However, you could say, okay, that's nice and easy, and then let's start to deconstruct. But as we are finding, and we've found with the protests and what's been going on, this is easier said than done. And this is easier said than done because this social construction has turned into fact, okay, for a lot of people. So I'm going to read you a quote from Jenkins from a book called Social Identity, okay, and he's talking about social construction. And he says, to invoke the first principle of social construction, groups are real if people think they are. They then behave in ways that assume these groups are real, and in doing so, construct that reality. Okay, so what we now have is hundreds of years of these global, these constructions being reinforced over and over and over again, so much so that we forget that they're myths, stereotypes, and assumptions, and we start taking them on as fact. And these social constructions have now gone global. Okay, so this isn't just a situation that affects America. It's a situation that affects the UK, the rest of Europe, Black people all across the world. Okay, I was even, I think I saw something on BBC One in terms of the Indigenous people in Australia and the discrimination that they are facing. All of that comes back to these historical social constructions, okay, that people have actually taken on, to the point where Black people themselves have even internalized some of these constructions, okay? So that's what I need you to bear in mind as we go through this, that, this issue of race is a social construction, okay? And that's why in terms of social science, a lot of academics tend to talk more about ethnicity rather than race, which is why race is in inverted commas, because it's a social construction. However, there are also issues with ethnicity, and that is actually not a clear-cut definition as well. So you can even say that that is possibly slightly a social construction as well. So let's think about how we start to address these ideas of race, and how we can start to actually deconstruct this idea of race and also deal with racism that's in our society. And we're going to go on to our first topic, which is education. Okay, so I've just tried to give you the most briefest talk in terms of historical context of the origins of race. Okay, however, the question I would like to get you thinking about is, how many of you knew and have heard exactly what I've just told you when you were in school? Okay, I wasn't told any of this in school at all in my history lessons. And it's very interesting that there was a petition done a few years ago now that was kind of demanding that Black history, more Black history, be put into the curriculum at school. So Theresa May responded to that and said, oh no, there's enough Black history in the curriculum. But I had to kind of think about that, and I thought, okay, now on one side, I can see, where we might be coming from in terms of, if we include Black history in the curriculum, then we need to include the history of all ethnic minority groups, and that could be too much and overwhelm the system. However, what I have an issue with is that a lot of so-called Black history has been labeled Black history, but it is actually human history and also UK history. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just dissect a little bit of that for you. Okay, if my slide will go on, it will work. Okay, having a bit of a technical difficulty, people. So, right, so I'm just gonna continue on. Okay, so one of the things that was really interesting, especially when I reflect on my old history classes, is that I didn't know anything in terms of the time before slavery. I remember explicitly somehow the Battle of Hastings, 1066, and I remember a little bit about kind of maybe Greek history, but I never knew anything in terms of a time before slavery, including Black people. So for those of you that don't know, when it comes to kind of human history, especially if we look at the case of Egypt, which was known as Kemet at the time, and that set the foundations in terms of maths, science, religion, art, etc. And for those of you that may have been lucky enough to go either to the British Museum or actually go to Egypt, as I have, you know, it's fascinating to see all of these everyday items were all already created within kind of Egyptian civilization. However, I never knew anything about that at school. And why that is dangerous is that, especially for young Black people, in terms of your inclusion in history, all that you are left with is that you were a slave, and that's it. Okay, you were a slave, and it depends how deep people were actually going to go into their lessons, because especially within my school, white lecturers were very nervous to even talk about slavery. So there was one mention of slavery in my class, everybody looked at me and we moved on. Okay, that was it for the whole of, you know, the inclusion, you know, talk on inclusion of Black people in history. So there is something to be said in terms of why do we always start from history and from slavery and that very quick mention, and then we stop and we don't speak about anything in terms of African civilizations and how they contributed to, you know, development things in human history, and why that was, you know, why that era was actually so important. And it's funny that I remember actually, I used to remember being an art student, and for some reason I kind of got fixated probably at about 13 and actually started drawing the Sphinx and lots of kind of Egyptian kind of artifacts, and I done it for fun and I done it at home. But yeah, I didn't know even then as I was drawing there was any link whatsoever back to Black people, and this had any link to me. So again, why aren't we told that information when it comes to just basic human history? The other issue as well is Black people in the UK, okay? And again, let's not just focus on slavery, let's focus even on before slavery. So for example, there's a wealth of information out there now that is actually documenting Black people that were in the UK in Tudor times, okay? Black people that were, you know, servants to the royal family, and they were not slaves, they were being paid and they were just treated as workers, okay? But again, we don't hear anything about that. So again, I knew about Henry VIII and his 8 wives, but I didn't know anything about any Black people that were actually in the UK. And to go back even a little bit further than that, Black people in positions of so-called power in the UK and Europe, again, didn't know anything about that as well. So an example of that would have been the Black Moors, who conquered southern Europe in 711 AD and also dominated parts of Scotland. And for those of you that may be familiar with London, may kind of go through Liverpool Street and Moorgate, and it's kind of a nice, wonderful, you know, kind of built up cosmopolitan area now. However, did you know that Moorgate was actually named after the Black Moors in London, because that's where they used to live? Okay, so you learn something every day. So, but again, how many people rush through Moorgate and they have no idea in terms of the history of, you know, Moorgate in London and the existence of the Black Moors? So again, why aren't we told anything about this in history? This is now UK history, so we're told lots of other things in terms of what was going on in London at that time, what was going on in the UK. So how come Black men, you know, Black people seem to kind of be cut out of this UK and human history. The other thing as well is obviously especially for young Black people, is role models as well, when they're actually kind of looking back to history and thinking, okay, well, who actually looks like me, who could be, you know, someone who I might find interesting in history. So one person I usually tell my students about is right, let's see if I can actually get this going, because you do need to, here we go. There we go, you do need to see. Right, so who is this man? Okay, some of you may know, but a lot of you may not know. This is Mansa Musa, okay? And he is known as the richest person who ever lived, okay? So the person that owns Amazon, I think is worth 125 billion. Mansa Musa, who was the ruled the Mali Empire, was worth 400 billion, okay, through trade of salt and gold. Very interesting. So when our young people were talking about, okay, who's the richest person who ever lived, and maybe, you know, Will Smith, Jay-Z, etc., actually it was Mansa Musa. Okay, very interesting. Something that we can actually, you know, kind of even put into, you know, our business classes, etc. Very interesting fact. But again, how many people know that? How many people are told that? How many young people are aware of that? And not just Black young people, just, you know, young people in general. Very interesting fact. So we've got lots of significant role models and Black figures, you know, that are very interesting throughout history. But yet again, you know, we are not told about these people. So again, there seems to be a strategic move to cut Black people out of history, and therefore kind of out of our education systems. And it's not just happening in school. This goes on through to college, and it goes on through to university as well, where we don't want to talk about the issue of race. And therefore that means that we don't really talk about Black people and the contributions that Black people have made in general historically, and also in the UK. And that kind of leads on to the last thing I want to kind of talk about in terms of education, is lack of Black educators. And also, I'm just going to say a little bit when I've put down language analysis as well. Have you ever thought about the connotations in language for Black and white? Okay, just think about that for a minute. Okay, so when we look at the connotations for white, there were 10 negative connotations for white out of about 134. When we look at the term Black and Blackness, there are 80 negative connotations out of 120. Okay, and even Martin Luther King actually commented, you know, why does the education system basically teach young students, Black students, that they're basically inferior and that they're negative? Okay, and all of this is impacted in our education and what we're brought up with. So, for example, you know, the black cat is evil. I was always very confused when I was growing up young when they described a film as a Black comedy. I always thought Black people were going to be in it, but yet it just means it's kind of a twisted, kind of dark kind of comedy, even right down to, for women in the audience, even right down to lipsticks. Okay, and that darker lipsticks are somehow vampy, and we're going to give them, you know, vampy, evil kind of names for dark lipsticks, which happen to see black women. So again, we have to look at the language, and also the educators who are not necessarily acknowledging Black people in history, not acknowledging Black people in education. And also it comes down to and highlights a lack of Black educators, period, across the educational system. So I said something before in terms of the HE experience and a lack of black educators. And you'll also find that there are more, especially within HE, there are more Black educators that are on contract only work than in terms of permanent posts. So therefore that means that their roles can be discontinued very quickly. But sometimes, you know, there were no Black educators at all, which was very interesting, particularly when I started out, because some students, you know, when I actually done some work around this with students, it kind of came out that I was not the typical looking lecturer. They did not expect me to come walking through the door. In fact, one of my students said, you know, when you came walking through the door, you went on the computer. I thought, who is that student using the computer? And then when you said you were the lecturer, I'm sorry, Veronica, I did think to myself, are you serious though? Because you don't look like a lecturer. And then we had to dissect, well, what does a lecturer look like? And basically what they were expecting was a white male to be running their module, okay? Because that's who they link with intelligence, and that's what a lecturer traditionally looks like. So we do have this issue in terms of a lack of Black educators. And the issue there is, and it's not the case that Black people are the only ones that can talk about Black history and Black things. Any educator, any youth and community worker can talk about issues of race, okay, and can just do the research and explore some of these themes with students and young people. However, what Black educators can bring in may be different perspectives, okay, different perspectives, different ways of looking at things, as well as being an educational role model in its own right as well, okay? So, you know, there's something definitely to be gained by having kind of the inclusion of Black educators in our educational system, just to add to the, you know, a more diverse curriculum, okay? But we are not necessarily the ones who have to be just solely responsible for, you know, teaching about issues of race, okay? And because of that, what we are finding is that there is a silencing in terms of the race discussion. So therefore we have white academics and teachers that don't feel confident to talk about issues of race because they could be, you know, interpreted as being racist. But on the flip side, you also have Black students as well who feel nervous to talk about issues of race, particularly to a white educator, because they don't want to make that white educator feel uncomfortable. And what happens as a result of that is that we don't really talk about that at all. We don't talk about the issue of race at all because it makes everybody in the room feel uncomfortable. And that's something that we need to definitely address in terms of moving forward towards a future without racism. If we do not talk about it, if we do not, you know, get a more inclusive contribution of, you know, how Blacks, you know, Black people have contributed in terms of human history and UK history, we're going to be stuck on this cycle of just going back to those historical stereotypes and assumptions, and we're not going to change. Okay, so I've talked a lot. Okay, I would like to hear from some of you now. So we have a question and a poll, and I would like a bit of impact, you know, you to have a think, and you know.
I did get a bit excited to launch the poll.
Yeah, oh, you did? Okay.
Later on.
Okay.
But, you know, no surprise, the results are that the majority of our attendees here today said that they have not received any experience in education in terms of understanding race and identity.
Wow. Okay, so that's quite a lot, and that also, you know, mirrors my own experience. And again, even when we, you know, think about, you know, what we are taught, what Theresa May said was good enough, it seems that just, you know, mentioning slavery, and I think I remember working for Pupil Referral Unit where students, their Black history was students sitting down watching an episode of Roots. No. No, okay? You can't just sit young people down and say, watch this episode, you'll find out about slavery, without any kind of context to what was actually happening. And as most, you know, for some of the older generation, because there obviously is the historical Roots series and the newer Roots series, you do have to watch that throughout in its whole entirety to really get a clear understanding of what was happening at that time, and just to kind of plonk students down and say, oh, watch this and you'll find out about racism, really is not good enough. And then we kind of then go straight to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and then everything was okay again. Yay! The end. It's really not good enough. It's really not good enough, because still, especially for Black students, what they are left with is that we were slaves and then white people set us free. And that's my background. That's where I come from. And that can be extremely demoralizing for young people. And also white young people, that's all they recognize and all they know as well. So you go on to adult life thinking, that's all that we know about Black people, when, the contribution in terms of history and UK history is much, greater than that. So why isn't it being explored in education is the question that we need to ask ourselves. Okay, so one of the issues as well with education, which makes this tougher, is that a lot of our education we also get from the media. It's not just school. So we've come out of school now, we've come out of college, and we've only been maybe spoken to about slavery and a little bit about the civil rights movement, and we move on into kind of our teenage years, our adult life. And then media starts to take over. Okay, so this is where I'm now going to talk about the hypodermic syringe of media. So I've just used this picture. When seen as believing, those who program what we see can influence what we believe. Okay, so internalized ideologies. So let me just start off by talking about the hypodermic syringe model. What am I talking about here? It's a Marxist ideology. And I will kind of use the example of probably Adorno and Horkheimer, who wrote a book, The Enlightenment, as mass deception. Okay, and what they were talking about was the culture industry, the media, and the culture industry robs people of free thought. So those that are in power decide what is in the media, what gets played, what doesn't, and basically they are injecting each of us in the heads with all of these ideas that they want us to believe. Okay, so that's the hypodermic syringe, and it starts robbing us of our freefall and critical thinking, and starts to keep putting stereotypes and different and particular ways of thinking into our heads, to the point where we hear it so much that it becomes fact. Okay, and it works, and it is of the advantage of those that are actually in power. Okay, so linking this back now to kind of our kind of everyday media and the issue of race, and BME people in the media as well. Going later down the line, I'm going to use the example of Cedric C Clarke, and he was a communications scholar. And in the 60s, he done kind of a content analysis of American television. And he basically came up with 4 stages of representation in terms of the media. First stage was invisibility or non-recognition. Okay, so this is where particular groups are really not shown on the media at all, or there's no recognition of particular groups, and there's no recognition of particular images of those groups. The second stage is ridicule and stereotyping. Okay, so a group is put on television, however, they are put on television in a way which ridicules them or stereotypes them. And I'm thinking also here in terms of putting people, particular groups, into certain pigeonholes, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later on. Then the third stage is regulation. Okay, and in this stage, people of that particular group can have roles where they are authoritative roles, or roles around social order. They're upholding social order. Okay, and then the fourth stage is respect, where you see within a particular group, you see a diverse images of people on a particular group. Okay, and what Clarke kind of concluded was that Black people in particular were on the lower stages in terms of media representation. Okay, so in terms of invisibility and non-recognition and ridicule and stereotyping. So this was done in the 60s. now today we're, 2020, we have to question, has much really changed? Okay. And I will question, not necessarily. Okay. Now, this is a snapshot from a film documentary by Kerry Davis, which is available on YouTube, called A Girl Like Me. And within that documentary, she done a particular test called the black doll, white doll test. Now, this test was actually done in 1947 by Clarke and Clarke, the Brown versus Board of Education case, in terms of racial discrimination and the internalization of stereotypes. So basically, it was young people, and they were given two dolls. One was a white doll, one was a black doll. And they were asked, which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Okay. And within this experiment, and also Clarke and Clarke's original experiment, overwhelming majority of black children chose the white doll as the doll of preference, as the good doll, as the beautiful doll. The black doll was the ugly doll, was the bad doll, etc. Okay, and this test has been done numerous times across many different countries, and the last time I even saw this test done was on a recent documentary in terms of the school that was trying to challenge racism. I think they were showing it on Channel 4, and they done a variation of this test too and had exactly the same results. So why am I saying this? Because sometimes we tend to think, oh, okay, well, slavery is over, there are black people on television, things are getting better. However, if things are getting better, then how come our young people are still choosing the white doll as the doll of preference and the black doll as the bad doll up until this very date? So something is happening and going on here. And if we think about that kind of hypodermic syringe, something is happening and going on here with our children, okay? That somehow from somewhere, they're picking up, those connotations, those language connotations in terms of black and white, and they're already picking that up and starting to kind of use that to classify other people in terms of these dolls, and even in terms of themselves. Okay, where are they? Which doll do you look like? Okay, and can actually cause, and as you can see, if you watch the clip from that film, it actually caused some anxiety to one of the black little children in there who was asked, well, what doll do you look like? And she went to pick up the white doll, and then she put it down and pushed the black doll towards the researcher. Okay, she didn't even pick it up with pride, she just pushed it away, as in, yes, it's that one. Okay, but she clearly wasn't happy about it. So we have a continued issue in terms of what our young people are picking up. And to be honest, guys, I can talk for another hour in terms of probably children's television and what children are picking up. But, the important thing to gauge is that it's not necessarily from the parents. The parents are not necessarily to blame. They obviously, think that, children are children. They're just watching cartoons and, playing and getting on with life. However, somehow they are picking up these images, okay? And this internalization kind of starts to affect Black people, and also these images are internalized by other people in the community. So I'm just going to give you a few examples, okay? And I'm going to break it down in terms of gender. So I asked, for the past few years, I've asked my class to brainstorm and say kind of what, give me an example of successful Black women, okay? And they will start shouting out some names, and I say, right, can you give me an example of a successful Black woman who is not in sports, music, or entertainment? And all of a sudden the class goes very, very quiet, okay? And probably one of the only people that would tend to come up would be Michelle Obama, which is at the bottom in the middle. However, we've got a number of different other representations here, okay? And this is kind of goes back to what I was talking about in terms of stereotypical images and pigeonholes. And now we could sit there and say that that maybe some people may interpret that all of these women are quite empowering in their own particular way, okay? But the way that I dissect this is that there are pigeonholes of acceptability when it comes to Black women and media representations, okay? So we've got the music, okay? And it kind of really annoys me sometimes, actually, how whenever, you know, kind of mainstream media, you know, refer to, you know, Black singers, they're automatically a diva for some reason, you know. And there's that kind of connotation, oh, this diva representation, this diva music woman. And we accept that sphere. We accept that Black women can be good in sports. So we kind of look at the Williams sisters in tennis, you know, and athletes, etc. We can accept that, you know, Black people are good in sports. And then we've got other images there as well. So I've used the image of Cookie from Empire to kind of symbolize, and while I appreciate that some people probably did find her, you know, quite inspiring and empowering in some particular way, again, even, you know, that image of, you know, the loud, dominant Black woman bursting into rooms, bursting into the middle of meetings, and she went to jail for her man, etc. You know, all of this kind of comes back to a very similar narrative. And even the, you know, Empire, which was, you know, about a man and owning a music company, was still underpinned in criminality, drugs, etc. So we go back to that same stereotype in terms of, you know, linking even successful business people back to that criminal underpinning. In terms of going back to things of like music, I'm definitely a hip hop head, and that's kind of my thing. That's how I kind of grew up with hip hop. And, you know, it's really interesting sometimes looking, especially from the 2000 onwards, how the representation of women in hip hop kind of changed. Yes, we did have some sexual images in hip hop back in the 90s, but not to the same extent that we kind of have now. I've kind of used the image of Nicki Minaj, very hyper sexualized image, okay, of Black women, okay? And that seems to kind of tick a box. So the less clothes you wear, the more likely it is that you'll be popular and you'll be given airplay and exposure, okay? As opposed to the rapper who's kind of covered up. And there are many underground rappers, brilliant rappers that are in existence, female rappers that are in existence, but they just simply don't get any airplay. And one of the characteristics is they don't walk around half naked. They don't present themselves like that. And they are actually talking about real experiences in terms of being a Black woman, in terms of Black people. Some of them even very inclusive of Black history, but they don't get that recognition and airplay. And then you've got the other representation, which seems to kind of be dominating a lot of our media in terms of the reality TV. Love and Hip Hop, Housewives of Atlanta, etc. I have never met groups of Black women that have so many arguments every single day. You know, we have to think of what does that representation put out about Black women, okay? That, you know, money hungry, you know, consumed with, you know, designer clothes, etc. We're always arguing, we're having relationship problems, etc. All of this, and, you know, whilst this all seems like fun, this is actually, you know, these images get internalized by other people, that this is the way that Black women are. And therefore, you know, when it comes to what I would say kind of respectable and intellectual role models, you know, as I said in class, all we came back to is Michelle Obama. And remember as well, a lot of these representations are American. They are American. Where are the UK representations? Okay, so again, when it comes to you know, someone like myself in terms of a Black academic, I remember being described actually as the hip hop lecturer. Okay, not even a proper academic, like the hip hop lecturer, because I look more like I'm from a music video than I do an academic. Okay, so there are issues with this. So when I talk about kind of stereotyping, I'm also talking about those pigeonholes of acceptability, that it's fine for Black women to do music, sports, and reality TV, but yet we don't really see images outside of that. Okay, very similar can also be said for Black men as well. okay? Especially with the link to criminality, with the link to music and sports, etc. Okay, and what we need to do when we're actually looking at the media is be a little bit more critical in terms of what images and representations do we see, and what representations are also absent. So when I look at Black men, for example, these are some of the images that I find are quite absent. So therefore, the everyday Black working UK professional, hardly see anything on my screens in terms of the existence. And now I can go on to LinkedIn. There's loads of, Black male entrepreneurs, CEOs, etc., people that own their own businesses, all over LinkedIn, professionals working. But yet we do not see any of that in terms of our media. Okay, it's not a normalized thing. We are more likely to see, images such as, Top Boy and the gangster and the people in the hood. Okay, we don't even see images really of the Black middle class. There is a narrative with especially Black men that you're from the hood, you're working class, you're ghetto, etc. We don't even see the professional middle class Black male representation. In addition to that, in terms of deficit stereotypes as well, it goes back to this myth in terms of hypersexuality and Black men not being responsible fathers and having lots of women and creating lots of children, and even politicians blaming Black fathers for the reason why Black boys go into gangs, etc. However, I can assure you there are lots of thousands, millions of wonderful, brilliant Black fathers in existence, but yet we do not see this as a representation on TV. Okay, what we see is the other narrative of kind of that hypersexual, Black man who's not really in a stable relationship or not looking for a stable relationship. So where are the images of the positive Black fathers, and even all the organizations that are involved in terms of helping Black fathers? In the middle, I've got my lovely little Joshua Beckford. How many people know of Joshua Beckford? Okay, one of the youngest people to attend Oxford University at 6 years old. Okay, he wants to be a neurosurgeon when he gets older. Absolutely brilliant, and he's been named one of the most intelligent children in the world, and he has autism as well. But yeah, a lot of people have not heard of Joshua Beckford. Why not? Why not? Don't we think that that's probably a young person that other young people need to know about? Okay, but it seems, again, because it doesn't fit into that pigeonhole in terms of Black and intelligent, no, we don't like that pigeonhole. That pigeonhole doesn't really exist. So therefore, young people like this don't really get exposure in our media. We're so fixated with the deficit model, the criminal model, the gang model, that we don't even focus and give any acknowledgement to our intelligent young people. And moving on from intelligence, I go straight down to people like Akala, one of my favorite UK hip hop artists, and also a scholar, who's got doctorates, and he's also wrote a book called Natives, which is available to buy, talking about these issues of racism. However, you are much more likely to see Akala maybe on a talk show talking about racism than you are to hear his music, because his music is very heavily packed in terms of issues of racism and identity. And the mainstream music industry will not play his music, okay? And Akala's actually been very smart. He's actually kind of created his own platform so people can actually hear and purchase his music. But again, we need to ask ourselves, why doesn't the music industry support the kind of hip hop that Akala is doing, which is talking about Black identity, which is talking about issues of historical racism, etc. Why doesn't the music industry want to support somebody like that? Again, because it doesn't fit into that, probably that gangster rap kind of grime kind of narrative. And very quickly, we've got Rick Lewis here. I'm not sure how many people know of Rick Lewis. He's actually a UK millionaire. Okay, owns a property investment firm. But yeah, I can sit there and watch Dragon's Den. While I do acknowledge there are BAME people that have been on Dragon's Den. I have not seen any Black millionaires or Black investors. Why not? So these people actively do exist. Okay, and in the middle, I've just got a representation in terms of the Afro-punk movement, which is going mainstream in the US, UK, even in parts of Africa and over Europe. You know, that not all Black men fit into any hip-hop stereotype, criminal stereotype. There are lots of diverse Black images and role models that are actually, you know, available, but yet they don't get shown. We stick with those kind of stereotypical kind of images. Okay, so we do need to think, you know, about how, you know, our representations kind of govern what we think. And even if you have power, you can't escape. Okay, if we just use this example in terms of Obama, the first Black president, even though he was the first president of mixed heritage, but again, that's another side issue. But if you look at the ridicule that Obama actually faced, I mean, it was actually disgusting throughout his presidency. So it shows that these historical stereotypes are still active, you know, and even affect the person who's one of the most powerful people in the world. Okay, and how does this link to everyday racism? Okay, well, of course it links to racism. If you put, you know, especially young Black men and females in pigeonholes, you know, in terms of criminality, you know, when it comes to young people on the street, we are judged in terms of criminal stereotypes. And I'm not even talking about being even interpreted as someone from a gang. It could be just following someone going into a shop, like my experience going into a shop and being followed around by security because I think I'm going to take something. Okay, even in terms of employment and recruitment, you kind of, yes, you'll be good at, you know, music, sports, etc., but not necessarily good when it comes to intelligence and holding a management role, for example. Health and social care as well, whilst we're kind of clapping for the NHS, 40% of the NHS are from the BAME backgrounds, okay? And there are many experiences historically and also now in terms of the racism that Black NHS workers have to experience. And there's actually a documentary, I think, available on BBC One iPlayer, talking about the experiences of Black nurses historically. And that hasn't changed, you know, either. So again, all of these stereotypes end up affecting how people are actually treated in real life. Okay. I could go on, but I'm gonna stop myself because I know that I'm running out of time. So we are gonna go to our next poll. Okay, Maxine, would you be able just to kind of chip in here a little bit, because I just literally need to kind of just do something with my computer. Okay, so people thinking about Clarke's stage model representations, which stage do you think describes UK Black people? Okay, UK, not American Black people, UK Black people in the media. So invisibility, non-recognition, ridicule and stereotyping, and regulation. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you for a few minutes, just to kind of see, kind of get those thoughts coming in. Maxine, would you just be able just to hold the fort for a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, while people are actually responding. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, there's still more people able to vote. Thank you.
Okay, so do we have any results for our poll?
Yeah, people are still voting.
Okay.
In.
So again, it's very interesting, even, you know, even from the images that I've shown you, you know, a lot of these images are coming from America, okay? So they are detailing the African-American experience. However, we need to be careful because sometimes there is a danger of thinking that everything that happens in America and all the kind of images that we get from America is completely applicable to the UK. And that's not actually the case. While we do share similarities, we you know, we can't, it's a bit dangerous to keep letting the African American experience speak for all Black people. And that's globally as well. So it's not even in case of just the UK. So much Black media in terms of Europe, in terms of the Caribbean, in terms of Africa. Okay, and we end up then being judged, Black people in the UK end up being judged from the African American experience. Okay, so we do need to think about kind of, you know, in terms of British media, kind of what is happening with the UK Black representation. Okay, so we have got some interesting poll findings. Okay, so we've got 22% that feel that Black people in the UK are invisible or don't really get recognition. And we've got 67%, okay, who feel that representations fall into ridicule and potential stereotyping. And I'm assuming for most of you, you're kind of maybe agreeing that Black people tend to be put in pigeonholes of kind of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, okay? And even whilst we can sit there and say, okay, so well, some of these pigeonholes, you know, can be positive. If we look at, you know, Beyonce and Jay-Z, you know, you've made millions, you've inspired lots of people all over the world, but you've only been able to do that within a particular pigeonhole of acceptability, which is music. Okay, and that's kind of what Black people do. And then when it comes to obviously other business, they can kind of create other businesses up from that. Okay, but that's the foundation of you know, of where they have started in something that's actually acceptable. And this links back to, again, those historical assumptions and stereotypes, okay, where Black people throughout slavery provided entertainment. They were known for, you know, their singing and music. They were known in terms of their physique and being actually stronger, you know, perceived as stronger, and as I said, quite animalistic. So therefore it will make sense that they are better at sports, etc. So all of these things that we're seeing in our media today all has the foundations in terms of those historical stereotypes and assumptions, okay? And even when we think about the media, I think it was one of my favorite comedians, UK comedians, Lenny Henry, was still kind of advocating with the BBC that there is still not enough diversity in terms of BBC One representations and also in terms of Black people in the media. And that then comes to highlight that this issue of race and also racism is systemic. It's in and inbuilt into all of our systems, and the media is one of those systems, okay? And obviously, as we have seen with, you know, what's happened with George Floyd and, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, this is now being highlighted in terms of how racism is systemic in each, you know, in every sector in our society. So I'm just going to give a few examples. So we kind of know already about the criminal justice system, both in especially in America and over here, and you know, very similar in terms of discrimination happening right from the beginning of the process, even in terms of stop and search. And I am absolutely amazed that even after all of the protests and George Floyd, I am amazed to be seeing even more footage of police, you know, with their, you know, arms and neck, you know, on people's necks still, that we're seeing on the news. I mean, it's, you know, it's ridiculous. We are not moving forward, and underpinning that is, again, all of those historical stereotypes and assumptions made about Black people in terms of being the criminal, okay, or the assumption that they are criminal. Okay, I'm not going to go on too much about that because we're seeing a lot of that happening, and that's kind of underpinning the movement that we have now. In terms of employment, again, we've got that systemic racism, and as I said in my last webinar, you know, that can even come from the recruitment process. I know I have seen and experienced when there is a position available in a company, and Black people will apply for those positions. However, then come to find out somebody has automatically moved into this position and didn't really need to apply. okay? And we have to really think about the ethics and the mindset that actually underpins this. This is actively going on. I've heard a lot of Black professionals talk about these instances. I've also even had a story from somebody who was actively told, it was quite a prestigious firm in, I think, Marble Arch, and the manager actively told that worker, if you get any CVs with names that sound foreign, throw them away. What I didn't know is that person was also belonged to a BME group, but maybe wasn't perceived as such. Okay, so they were actively told to throw the CVs of any CVs with anyone that had a foreign sounding name. Okay, so right from the very beginning, we have issues in terms of systemic and institutionalized racism within kind of the employment sector. Who gets hired, who doesn't get hired, and how does that affect the racial hierarchy that can be in organizations? So typically when, especially in terms of consultancy work that I have done as well, typically the comments are that there is a racial hierarchy where those who are at the top, the CEOs and senior management, tend to be all white, and those who kind of more doing the frontline work, that is where you'll find more of the BME staff and Black staff. So why is that? Okay, so why is that? What is happening in terms of, Black people moving up that ladder in terms of kind of those higher management roles? And it was even a conversation I was having even the other day in terms of football. I don't know much about football, people. I'll hold my hands up to that. But why are there so many Black football players, but yet not many Black football managers? I kind of scratched my head. I didn't understand when, lots of Black men tend to dominate football. Why are there not any Black managers? So again, we do need to look at racial hierarchy in organizations. We do need to think about kind of what's happening in health and social care and how people are, those systems. So again, that racial hierarchy is evident in the NHS, and there's evidence to support that Black workers tend to be more the frontline staff doing the work. And if the more you go up the hierarchy, the more it tends to be kind of white dominated, which has underpinned obviously what we're hearing about BME and Black NHS workers contracting coronavirus more than other people, okay, because they are more likely to be on the lower end of the employment scale. Okay, and youth and community work. So this is kind of my sector. This is probably all of our sectors. What happens in terms of racism within youth and community work? And one of the things I remember, especially when I was first starting out in community work, is assumptions made by youth workers, which they didn't really think necessarily was racist, but was kind of underpinned by racism. Okay, so for example, I worked on a music project, a BME music project, which involved over 250 young people. However, thinking back to that, I'm not really sure necessarily how to even feel about that project, because on one sense, whilst it started out well and we were, providing young people with qualifications through that work, part of me felt, are we just actually winding up a group of particularly young Black males and basically saying that music is the only thing that you can do? That's the only thing that you're good at, okay? They've obviously watched, looking at the media, they've not been told anything in terms of Black history. They've not been told anything in terms of Black historical role models. So what they will see is the media that is presented and the media representations that's presented to them within those pigeonholes. So what Black boys aspire to is music and sports, because that's what they see in the media now. Okay, so that's what they aspire to. However, when, in terms of having that internalization, then we've already cut off that this young person could maybe be a Black scientist, could be an entrepreneur, okay, is really good with numbers, okay. We're cutting all of that off to say, oh no, that's what those Black boys like. So we'll give them a music project and they can do some CDs. And there is something very dangerous about that thinking and making assumptions that just because they're Black and they like hip hop, yeah, we'll just give them a music project and that, and that's our work done. We've got a lot of people involved, and that was a really good project. but how has it actually helped them in terms of their own personal self-development and their own identity in terms of finding out what they are good at and also exploring their aspirations. Okay, so there is a danger there of what I put down as doing racism. Okay, where you unconsciously are doing racism. Either your ideas are based on stereotypes, or you see something happening, you don't say anything, so therefore you are colluding with that as well. Okay, so that can happen in terms of youth and community work. That can happen, that doing racism can even happen with employment. If you can see that certain people have to apply and other people are kind of shifted into positions of power without application, and you don't say anything and you just collude with that, you are actively doing racism and contributing to that systemic racism. Okay, so guys, I have talked a lot and I'm gonna now throw a question back to you just out of interest and thinking about your own organizations. Okay, what does your senior management team look like? Okay, so we've got no BAME staff at all. Okay, so BAME is Black and minority ethnic staff at all. Okay, does your team have maybe at least one BAME staff but no Black Caribbean staff? Third option, at least one Black African Caribbean manager. And last option is a Black CEO or head of service. Okay, so just curious to kind of find out what's going on in your organizations in terms of this idea of racial hierarchy. Okay, and kind of what we're doing about that.
Yeah, people are voting, so
okay, good.
I think we're all done. Let me just share that.
Okay, well, that's very positive. Okay, so that's very positive. Okay, so only 12%, there's no BAME staff in their senior management teams. 26%, they have at least one BAME staff in their management team, but not Black Caribbean. But that's quite good. So we've got 60% have at least a manager or head of service, okay, which is very positive. And in terms of, you know, again, a future without racism, that's kind of really what we need to see. We need to make sure that there are no roadblocks when it comes to kind of issues of recruitment in every single system that we have going. So whether it be education, youth and community work, the criminal justice system, etc., we need more representation throughout all of these organizations in order, you know, to even, you know, think about a future without racism, okay, and steps forward. So that's quite positive in terms of our youth and community work sector, okay. So I'm just going to summarize, and this is probably going to link straight back to some of your questions. What is the way forward? How do we kind of work towards a future without racism? Well, the first thing that, you know, we need to think about is just you as a person, okay, your personal effort. And that is something that all of you are doing today. All of you that are joining me today, you're already kind of doing that already, even just listening to this talk, okay, shows me that you are, you know, open in terms of hearing information and thinking about how that kind of fits up here in your toolbox of information, okay, and your experiences. So it's about thinking about identity, thinking about race, and acknowledging race, the issue of race as a social construction, and start thinking about where we get our ideas from, okay. How have we got ideas? Where did they come from? And what has been absent? And why do we think certain representations are absent, okay? So we do have to do some work personally in terms of learning and also unlearning, okay? And I know in the previous webinar, you know, kind of in terms of if you're a white practitioner, kind of what can you do in terms of working with maybe Black young people? So it kind of is a bit of personal and professional mixed in here. Yes, you can read the books. You know, there are lots of books out there. So for example, this is Peter Fryer's Stay in Power, The History of Black People in Britain. okay, which is available on Amazon. So they're kind of all of this kind of literature. And Robin Walker, one of our Black historians, who has written this book, Before the Slave Trade, as well. So, you know, really informative books that are actually out there for purchase. However, it doesn't need to be that serious, okay? There's at the moment, I think Sky have shown so many different documentaries, okay, in terms of the, you know, the history of Black people, stuff around the criminal justice system, etc. So it can just take small steps in terms of you just being more informed in terms of tapping into some of those documentaries. So for example, documentaries on Netflix. So I would definitely recommend 13th. That's on Netflix. And When They See Us, which kind of is an emotional kind of roller coaster in terms of really how this actually affects, you know, the real life effects in terms of the assumptions that young Black people are criminal. There's stuff on YouTube, etc. So there's so much information out there. We are in the information age, okay? So much information out there. The more that we can actually kind of tap into, the more that we can increase our own mindset, okay? And we can start to challenge some of these ideologies that have taken hundreds of years kind of to kind of cement, and we can start unpicking that and destructing this issue of race and racism in ourselves. And your personal will always affect your professional practice. Okay, we like to say that things are objective and my professional practice is objective for my personal. No, it's not. No, it's not. You bring your personal into your professional practice. Okay, so with that information, with that new information, you might find that it will be very useful, particularly when you're working with young Black people. Okay, and just acknowledging that there are particular groups, BME groups, not just Black, but particular BME groups who potentially have a deficit model and image of self, okay? And how it might affect them in terms of their self-image, in terms of their progress in education, their aspirations, also their mental health, I can tell you personally, it is soul destroying to watch a Black person being killed on your mobile phone, okay? It can actually be quite traumatic. Okay, and you can always think, okay, that could have been me, that could have been my relative. It's actually a very traumatic experience. So we can't just not talk about these issues. We do need to support people who have found these images, you know, both Black and white, who have found these images extremely traumatic and don't know how to process them. And you don't need to be a scholar to teach anything about Black inclusion in history. You do not have to. I wouldn't count myself as a Black historian. I count myself as a social scientist. But again, there's so much information out there that you can just, you know, provide little snippets of information to young people, and that can actually make all of the difference. So if we kind of all start thinking about our professional and personal practice, we can then start to get organizational change, where we start to actively challenge these stereotypes and these assumptions. Okay, and then we can actually start inputting that into our organizations. How do we provide a service to our service users? How do we provide a more inclusive service? How do we provide a more diverse service? And do we have that diverse workforce to support that work that's being done? And when we do that organizational work, that's when we can actually get cultural change, and we can be on the path to a future without racism. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because I have over-talked, and I would love to hear some of your questions or comments. So I'm going to pass back to Maxine.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. Thank you, Veronica. I'm going to invite Deji to review the Q&As and to pose those questions to you.
Okay.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Maxine, as well. Just want to say again how powerful that presentation was and is. Just sitting here, just listening to you and reflecting on myself as an individual, but also reflecting on the work that we're doing in Brent. I just want to thank you and commend you, Veronica. Thank you so much. Yes, there's a couple of questions, a few questions from the floor that has been coming in during the course of your presentation. I want to encourage, if there's anybody else, if you have any questions, then please feel free to send those questions through. now as well, and then I will try and pick up as many as I can and share them with Veronica. I guess an interesting question that came from Sharon was, she said, I find that many Black teachers are trained in delivery that's racist too. Because they don't have knowledge of Black history, they can't challenge it. Is that something you would agree with, Veronica?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I said it's not just Black people that are the specialists in Black history. Black people themselves and probably those teachers were not taught anything either. So they will go by the mainstream curriculum. And we have to remember as well, and it's very interesting, particularly when we're looking from a global perspective, this isn't just an issue in the UK, this is also an issue in terms of the American educational curriculum. Doesn't really have much into outside of slavery and civil rights as well in terms of Black history, but also a very interesting conversation I've had with many African students who've been educated in Africa, and my assumption automatically was, oh, so you probably know a lot of this in terms of African history. And they said, no, we have an English curriculum in our countries, so not even Africans know about African history. And so in terms of those African, the black teachers here, they wouldn't know either. They wouldn't know any more than a white teacher. And also, when I was also talking about the silencing of race as well, some Black teachers may feel they don't want to put themselves in an uncomfortable position to even start talking about it either, because it will even make the white students feel uncomfortable, and if anything's said, they could go back and report it to their manager, then I will get in trouble. So there's a whole mindset in terms of why a Black academic would also not talk about any issues of race or racism at all, because we'd rather stay in this safety box where we don't talk about anything. But yet the issue is, if we don't talk and exchange dialogue around this, nothing's going to change. And this is why things are not changing, because we're not talking about this. Okay. And again, we're seeing Black history as something very niche, as in it is just another part of human history. Why was I learning about the Battle of Hastings 1066 for so long in school? People felt that was useful for us as students to learn, when we could have been learning about ancient Egypt in the same way. It's still a part of human history, UK history, etc. So again, there's this silencing of race where both Black and white do not want to talk about issues of race. So absolutely. And again, it's not just Black people that need to introduce these issues to education and young people. All of us have a responsibility. All of us can do something.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And I think this next question kind of leads in quite well, quite nicely actually, because this question is looking at, who should be teaching this kind of contextualized history? Should it be, is it the place for schools, or is it a place where maybe voluntary sector kind of pick up? Because if people and teachers, like you said, are kind of battling this kind of silence, they're not feeling comfortable for whatever reason, we're looking towards someone to be brave, I guess, in order to kind of take that step. Is this a space then maybe that the voluntary sector, for example?
Absolutely. For me, it's as many sectors as possible, as far as I'm concerned, and at every level of formal and informal education. And this is the issue, because we have labeled this as some niche kind of area. It feels that it's kind of inaccessible, that it's something that a specialist needs to talk about, and it doesn't have to be that serious. It really doesn't have to be that serious. It's just kind of maybe small things. So, for example, when I'm even teaching my students, I actually bring this book in, because this book is actually full of pictures, lots of different lots of different things there, kind of in terms of ancient African history, linking it to issues today. So I actually kind of bring this book in and say you can actually have a flick through it. And I use a few examples from it. It does not mean I need to do a whole module dissecting everything in this book. And that will probably be way too heavy from any student. So again, it's just trying to, we are in the information age, whatever, we can literally even just Google stuff. Google, for example, Black inventors. Why not have a quiz in school or within your youth club when it comes to even Black History Month? Okay, can anyone name any Black inventors? Okay, just out of interest, I've got these books that are available as well. Okay, 5 brilliant Black scientists. Okay, 5 noble inventors. Okay, only very thin books.
Yep.
Okay, so again, these resources, are available on Amazon. There are kind of, websites kind of that list all of kind of the Black inventors. So it's as serious as you want to make it. But for me, in terms of a starting point, something is better than nothing. Do not feel that you have to be this big historian and specialist. Go really deep, and also it depends on what level and who you're actually working with, because primary school will be much different from secondary school. Secondary school will be different from college. College will be different from university in terms of what you expose people to at each stage. So definitely voluntary sector and youth work, absolutely, you can definitely kind of bring in some of this information, and you can do it quite creatively. But we need to get rid of this stigma, because we've internalized it, that Black history is this niche thing over here, and that's also what we need to deconstruct. It's just another part of history.
I just want to ask one.
I was just going to say, we have kind of run out of time. I just want to fine. I just want to give the sort of last minutes to Chris Murray, just to sort of provide some next steps for people. We are going to run another webinar in October, and we will obviously continue these conversations then.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you, Veronica. And again, always inspirational. I've known you for many years, maybe too many years for this webinar, but it's fair to say I learn every single time. And when I think I know what you're going to say, you throw a curveball and I'm learning again, and I'm having to quickly go on my phone and check and do my research, because you're always telling me, do your research. And it's actually been of really benefit to me. What I wanted to do was just share a couple of thoughts around what Young Brent Foundation is doing in this space around next steps. It could be a pathway for other organisations that's on this webinar, and it's also a challenge, I suppose, back to us if you feel that we could be doing things differently. We have what's called an appreciative inquiry model. We take challenge on, and we are very challenging. We have very much a diverse team. We have different thoughts and feelings about how the world is shaped. Very much like Veronica said around contextual, certainly global historical context is important. So we do challenge. We look at 3 things, and we're going to focus on those 3 things. My team's heard me with this 100 times, and it's a bit of a call, really, so people remember what we're about. 1 is education. So we look at the formal, the informal, and the non-formal environments where we have interactions with young people. Could that be schools? That could be our youth clubs. That could be our supplementary schools. And everything Veronica said today fits into all those spaces. There is no space where we're working with young people to inform them of the future, inform them of the social constructs around them, where that doesn't come into play. The second one is around the environment, which again, Veronica touched on so eloquently, around how we see ourselves, self-loathing, others, how we inspire each other, how we don't inspire each other at various points in our journeys towards adulthood and towards retirement in my case. So it's always about learning and reflecting on where we're at. So the social environment, who we interact with, the physical environment, where we live and how we live, and then the political environment, how do we encourage and support young people to understand how social action can really make a difference? We saw some really beautiful images over the last 2 or 3 months of young people just getting on and making change. I think Maxine touched on it earlier about the Cecil Rhodes statue. And I suppose out of my lexicon from in the 80s to now, when we knew a country named Rhodesia. You know, it's no longer in existence. So for me, it does take time, but it can happen and it will happen. I spent a bit of time yesterday afternoon in a funeral procession for Joe Louis in the United States. And again, extremely moving, but that's in my lifetime. So again, we can do this, and we must do this. There isn't a choice. And then the third thing is around complex traumas. It's something, again, that, you know, Veronica touched on. Is about how do we support young people and ourselves to stay on this path that we know is the right path to make a difference. And we have to factor in that lots of people, whether they're parents or young people or professionals, all come with a different perspective. And so we have to explore that from their point of view as we reach a sort of understanding, a joint understanding. So from our point of view, the final thing is always about employment. So young people are young for only a very short space of time, but an adult for a very long time. So we do need to support them to understand how resilient they need to be in the marketplace, how skilled they need to be able to push forward in their careers. There was an image that Veronica used, which I think I might need to steal, the glass ceiling, you know, and there is absolutely a social construct around glass ceilings. And it's for us to break through that and smash it to pieces. And so we do another three things. One, intercultural dialogue. We do talk about culture. And we do talk about the differences that we make, whether that's from an African or an Asian diaspora, whether we're talking about people from the minority ethnic communities across Europe or South America. We can and should talk from different people's perspectives to get an understanding. Brent has the largest Polish community in London. It also has the largest Latin American community in London. It had, in the 60s and early 70s, the largest African and Caribbean community. So Brent has been at the forefront of lots of conversations for a very long time, and we will just continue that journey. That's the work we do. The second thing we will really focus on is around intersectionality, and again, I'm going to steal this from Veronica because she's been doing this work, and I've been in Brent just over a year, and this is very much part of our reason for being, is looking at the power imbalance between men and women, not just based on the color of our skin or our culture, but actually how the system supports men primarily, and I fall into that bracket too. So it's about how do we do that consciously and in the moment. And so I have a staff team that reflects the dynamics of the borough. I have a very senior fundraiser who reminds me daily of what I should and shouldn't be doing. And I take that all on board because that's where you learn. So I have no issues with that. I'm comfortable in my skin, so that's not an issue. And then the third thing for me, just like I said earlier around complex trauma, is that we have to do a lot of work on self. And we have to do a lot of work with young people on self and others, how they see themselves and how they see people around them. And that's fundamental to the work that we do. Deji is working on some pieces of work now around intercultural dialogue and how we can support the sector to get that training off the ground. Unfortunately for COVID, it's not something we really want to do online. We've had lots of conversations over the last couple of months. Should we? And the answer has always been no. So we haven't, so we'll wait. And when we can do this in a real live situation, we'll put the training on. If you're from Brent or from the beneficial area, you will get it for free. It's not an issue. You're one of members of the family. If you are from outside of the Northwest London corridor, then unfortunately you will need to pay. That is the way of the world. This isn't a free service, but we do want to empower people to make choices for themselves. So we will be putting on some training for the sector. And then I suppose the final thing I want to touch on, if I have 2 minutes, Max, and if you give me the nod, if I've got time, was about the next step for us. And it kind of leans, again, Veronica stole a bit of my thunder on this final slide, but I'm going to say it anyway. One was around personal, one is around participant to our role within that. One is about us as a performer. What's the role that we play? And do we perform at our highest potential all the time? Or do we fall into an organizational culture where we think that's just enough? I don't want to create a wave around me because I might lose my job or my position and so on and so forth. And then the third one is a prisoner. So are we trapped in a role that we are unhappy with? Are we able to navigate that role to be the best that we can be for children and young people? I am solely talking about those that work with children. I'm not talking about children per se, but I am talking about teachers, doctors, people in local authority, the NHS, the voluntary sector. We've all got to think about our reason for being in the job. We've all got to think about our performance. We've all got to think about the way in which we participate in conversations. And also we mustn't be trapped by the narrative that's around us, i.e. become a prisoner to what's going on. Don't sit in silence. because we know now silence is also part of that collusion. So let's not do that. You can say whatever you need to say if it's done with honesty and with integrity, but it's the wrong thing to say anyway, because people around you will navigate with you and support you. So don't feel you cannot say because you think it might sound racist. It probably is if you're thinking it. Say it anyway, and then we can explore it together. I think it's really important. And again, I'm going to go back to what Deji said earlier. We are all on a journey and we are all learning. Veronica's been in this space for the best part of 10 years, if not any more than that. I'm sorry, Veronica's kind of put that age on you, but I've known you for that length of time, and this has always been an inspirational space. So I think I'll leave it there, if that's okay, Maxine. But we are on this journey in Brent. I know across Northwest London, we are also on this journey of reflection. So I just think we just need to carry on with that banner and carry that baton on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Again, thank you again, Veronica. Like I said, whenever there's an interaction with you, there's just constant learning. So really appreciate that. Thank you everyone for joining us. As I said before, we will be posting the link on our website, and there'll be a further conversation with Errol Donald, who was also a panelist from the webinar on the 24th of June, and he'll be doing a webinar in end of September. So thank you all again and have a great afternoon. Thanks a lot. Bye.